Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty interesting. The global differences in how men and women identify on the political spectrum. We've got this fascinating excerpt about it, and a chart that really brings it all to life visually.
Definitely. It's a topic that I think a lot of people have assumptions about, so it'll be interesting to dive into the data.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so first things first. When we talk about the left-right political spectrum, we're generally using that common scale where the left is associated with things like social change, government intervention, more of a focus on equality.
Right. And then on the other side, you have the right, which tends to be more about tradition free markets.
Hierarchy.
Yeah.
But like we always say on these deep dives, you got to remember that these terms can have real different meanings depending on the country and its specific history.
That's a crucial point. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Are you ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's do it.
In the data skies, we take our flight. Trends and numbers come to life. Colors and charts, they dance and play. Showing truth in a visual way. In GenderDecoded, we uncover truths and stories like no other. In the data waves we find the secret maps of humankind.
Well, today we're going to tackle something that I think a lot of people find, well, kind of confusing, to be honest.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's politics, but not just like the everyday headlines, We're going deeper. We're looking at the political spectrum, that whole left-right thing that everyone's always trying to figure out where they fit.
Yes, the age-old question. Am I a lefty or a righty? And what does that even mean?
Exactly. And what's really interesting? There's a noticeable gender gap in how men and women see themselves on that spectrum.
Oh, for sure. When you look at the data from big surveys, it's definitely a pattern that jumps out.
So to really unpack this whole thing, we're going to use this really cool chart.
Wow, a visual aid, always helpful.
It's from the World Values Survey, and they gather data from all over the world between 2017 and 2022.
So we're getting a global perspective.
Yeah, a real snapshot of how different countries and cultures, see this whole left-right thing and how men and women kind of position themselves differently. And honestly, the results are pretty surprising.
You can say that again.
Okay, so first off, in those typical Western democracies, places like Canada, Iceland, even Switzerland, men tend to lean a bit further to the right than women.
Yep, and Canada especially stands out. The gap there is pretty significant.
So what do you think's going on there? Why are men in these kind of places leaning more to the right?
Well, you got to consider the whole context, right? Many Western democracies, they really emphasize individual freedom, less government involvement. So maybe men are more drawn to those kinds of policies, free markets, less regulation, that sort of thing.
Makes sense. But wouldn't women living in the same place kind of be influenced by the same things?
Of course. But here's the thing. Even though we're all exposed to the same systems, men and women, well, they often have different needs and priorities.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're getting at. Women are more likely to rely on things like government-funded healthcare or childcare, right? So maybe they're looking more towards parties that are going to really support those social programs.
Exactly. It's not just about some abstract ideology. It's about how those ideas actually play out in people's everyday lives. And you know what? This chart, it throws some real curveballs our way, too.
Yeah, you're talking about those countries where it's actually the women leaning further to the right.
Exactly. Libya, Bolivia, even Spain popped up with, those red bar stretching out.
I was really surprised by that. So if it's not just about, economics or welfare programs, what else could be driving those kind of unexpected results, especially where women are the ones leaning more to the right?
Well, one thing we can't ignore is the whole cultural and religious landscape. These things have a huge impact on people's values, and that definitely spills over into their political choices.
So can you give me an example of how that plays out in those countries where women are leaning more to the right?
Let's take Bolivia. It's a place where traditional family values and religious beliefs are really influential, especially among women. So political parties that align with those values, well, they probably resonate more strongly with women there.
Right. If a party's emphasizing those traditional values, women might feel like they get it. But wouldn't those same values influence men's views too?
Totally. But the intensity, how those values are expressed, it can differ between genders. And it's all tied up with the historical and social roles women have played in these societies.
Are you saying those roles kind of make women more receptive to certain political messages?
Yeah, exactly. Think about it. If women have traditionally been the ones upholding family values or religious traditions, well, those experiences shape how they view everything, including politics.
Okay, this is getting really interesting. It's like peeling back all these layers and you see how gender, culture, and political ideology are all tangled up together.
And we're just scratching the surface. Wait till we dig into how things like political history and even the meaning of left and right can totally change depending on where you are in the world. That's when things get really fascinating.
All right, let's dive into that then. You mentioned how left and right can mean different things in different places.
Yeah.
So how does that mess with our whole gender gap thing?
Well, think of it this way. Those labels, they aren't some universal truth, you know? What's right-wing in one country might be totally left-wing somewhere else.
So we can't just make blanket statements like women are more left or men are more right. It all depends on where you are.
Exactly. You got to look at the history, the baggage that comes with those terms. Like, imagine a country with a past of, say, socialist or communist rule.
Okay.
Left-wing might have some pretty negative vibes for people there, especially women who might link it to tough times, you know, economic struggles or less freedom.
Oh, yeah, I see that. Those experiences would totally shape how you see those labels, and that affects how you vote, right? It's like a chain reaction.
Exactly. It's not just about the policies right now. It's about how those policies feel through the lens of history and what people have actually lived through. And speaking of experience, we can't forget about those expectations, those gender roles society kind of throws at us.
Yeah, we touched on that with Bolivia, but let's unpack it a bit more. How do those expectations, like what men and women are supposed to do, how does that affect how they see politics?
Well, think about those traditional roles. If a society's like, men, you're the breadwinners, then they might be more likely to support policies that are all about economic growth, less government messing with business.
Because those policies would, like, help them be better providers.
Right, and it kind of reinforces that whole idea that men are responsible for the money. But women, they're often expected to be the caregiver, so maybe they're looking for policies that offer more support, you know, like affordable childcare, parental leave, good health care.
So those policies would help them fulfill those roles society's kind of put on them.
Exactly. It shows how those deep-seated gender roles, they turn into different political priorities, and bam, you end up with different spots on that left-right line.
This is like a giant puzzle, isn't it? Economics, history, culture, gender roles, they all fit together to create this crazy, complex picture. No wonder things look so different around the world. But what about those places where the gap is tiny, almost gone? You mentioned Mongolia earlier. What's the deal there?
Good question. There could be a few things happening. Maybe those countries have a really strong, like, shared culture or political norms. So men and women's views just don't differ that much.
So there's more of a sense of, like, we're in this together, regardless of gender.
Exactly. Or maybe their political scene is relatively new, so those distinct gender patterns haven't had time to form yet.
That's interesting. So these gaps aren't set in stone. They change as societies evolve and new political stuff happens.
Exactly. And that brings up a huge question. How are all the changes happening globally? Like migration, globalization, even how gender roles are changing. How are all these going to reshape this whole political landscape and that gender gap?
Whoa, that's a big one. I can already see how that would shake things up. More migration means new cultures, new political ideas coming into different societies.
Totally. And as women gain more power, economically and socially, their political influence is going to explode.
It's like we're watching this huge dynamic process unfold. So what's the future of this gender gap in politics?
That's the million-dollar question, right? All the experts, they're trying to figure that out. But one thing's for sure, those global changes are going to keep influencing how men and women see themselves on that political spectrum.
Makes you realize that studying politics isn't about finding, like, the right answer. It's about understanding how complicated and messy human behavior is.
Couldn't have said it better. It's all about remembering that politics is always changing, shaped by so many different forces.
Okay, before we totally lose ourselves in all these crazy connections, let's do a quick recap of the big ideas we've talked about today.
Sounds good. We started by checking out that global gender gap, using that awesome chart from the World Values Survey. Remember how men tend to lean further right in those Western democracies, while women do the same in parts of Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Asia.
And then we dug deep into why, right? We found this crazy mix of stuff.
Yeah.
How well off a place is, those cultural and religious beliefs that run deep, historical stuff, and of course those gender roles that society just kind of throws at us.
And we also talked about how things are always changing. Globalization, migration, gender roles evolving. They're all adding more layers to this already crazy complex situation. It's a system that's constantly moving.
It's like a giant puzzle where the pieces keep shifting. But even though it's complicated, understanding these patterns gives us a glimpse into what shapes our world and even our own political views.
It pushes us to move beyond those simple stereotypes and really appreciate how diverse and rich human political behavior actually is.
So to all our listeners out there, here's a thought to chew on. As we move deeper into the 21st century, how are these massive global changes technology, the economy shifting, social norms evolving, how are they going to keep reshaping the political landscape and that gender gap?
It's a question worth thinking about, one that'll keep the researchers and the policymakers busy for years to come.
You know, it's crazy to think something like the left-right spectrum can get so complicated when you bring in all these global things.
It really shows you just how connected everything is, right? Like what's happening politically in one country could be shaped by something happening on the other side of the world. And with everything changing so fast, it'll be interesting to see how things shift even more, especially with gender.
It's almost like we need like a whole new map, not just that left-right line.
Yeah.
Something that captures all those cultural things, historical things, economic stuff.
Oh, that's a great idea. Like imagine a map with multiple dimensions, not just your economic views, but also like your social values, your religious beliefs, even your experiences with like big historical events. It would paint a much clearer picture.
I'd love to see how people would cluster on a map like that.
Right.
Even whole countries. We might find some surprising stuff.
Absolutely. It would really challenge how we think about things and force us to be more critical about what shapes our own political identities.
Okay, I'm getting carried away with all this map making, but let's bring it back to our listeners and what we've learned today.
Yeah, for sure. So we started off with that interesting chart from the World Values Survey. Remember the one that showed that global gender gap in political ideology, how men tend to lean further right in those Western democracies, but women are leaning further right in parts of Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Asia.
And then we dug into the why of it all, right? Like what's behind those patterns? And we found this mix of things like how well off a country is, those deep cultural and religious beliefs, historical context, and of course those gender roles that society kind of puts on us.
We also talked about how the world's always changing, globalization, migration, gender roles evolving. They all just add more layers to this already super complicated picture. It's constantly in motion.
For everyone listening, I hope this deep dive gave you something to think about, maybe challenged some of your ideas or got you curious about politics in different parts of the world.
And maybe it's even made you think about how your own experiences and those global forces out there shape your own political views.
After all, knowing where you stand on that political spectrum is just the beginning. The real journey is figuring out the why behind it all.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's a journey of learning and discovering new things all the time.
And on that note, that's a wrap for our deep dive into the gender gap in political ideology. Until next time, keep those minds open and keep those conversations going.